Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and University of Maryland professor of public policy. We have Mr. Andre Wong, who's the general counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty for the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Nia Johnson, who's an assistant professor at Duke School of Law. And we have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. Great to have you guys here with us and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, I want to start off with an interesting segment. This is a segment regarding Chase Bank. And what Chase Bank did in this particular instance almost seemed reasonable, but then unreasonable all at the same time. They allegedly actually closed the bank account of a religious freedom nonprofit organization because they made a demand on their donor list, and it turns out that the organization was unwilling to let that be the case. The name of this group was the National Committee for Religious Freedom. They're nonpartisan. They're a multi-faith nonprofit, and they are founded by the U.S. Ambassador at Large for the International Religious Freedom, Mr. Sam Brownback, who used to be in that position and was totally shocked that when he came to the bank and he went to basically open an account, it was no problem. But then several weeks later, he was informed that he went to put another deposit in, that we will not accept it. Your account has been canceled. We're sending you your money back. And we're not going to be able to do anything more with you until you let us know who your donors are. Now, on one hand, you look at this situation and say, wow, this has gone too far, because what many people don't realize is that most religious and nonprofit groups do not necessarily have to make all of their books and records and things of that nature available to banks. However, the banks do have also a requirement to actually know who your customer is and know where the source of funds comes from. Now, I don't know how we balance this, but on one hand, I understand that we now have a banking industry that has certain requirements that it has to follow, but it also has to juxtapose that with religious organizations that have their own state of requirements. You know, Bettina, when you hear this particular situation, where you see a nonprofit organization, bank account canceled because they're unclear what the donors are, is this a bridge too far? Or is this really something where it's an unclear path forward and how you satisfy both sides of the equation?
Well, Orland, let me say first up, I worked on Capitol Hill when Sam Brownback was at the State Department. He was ambassador for international religious freedom. I interviewed him for Liberty Magazine a couple of years back. I've worked with him on various issues. I can assure you he is highly unlikely to be involved in either money laundering or terrorist activities, which Chase Bank said that it was trying to exclude by seeking this information on Sam Brownback's 501c4 nonprofit. And that's an interesting point. It's a 501c4 nonprofit. It is a political action nonprofit. Now, Ambassador Brownback is well known for holding religiously and politically conservative views. They're very conservative views, not outside the mainstream of political discourse, but they have earned him a certain reputation within the political realm. Now, given how all this unfolded, it's kind of a he said, she said, or he said, the bank said scenario on how it all unfolded. But it does seem that the account was actually cancelled before Ambassador Brownback had a chance to really engage with the bank. So, you know, the upshot here, Orland, is, yeah, it's balancing. The banks have a certain legal responsibility, but we need transparency that these institutions, powerful institutions, aren't using their legal obligations perhaps as a proxy, as a cover for illegal discrimination against Americans based on their political and perhaps religious views.
But you know, Andre, there was a time when you probably thought about a church maybe 50 years ago. You're kind of imagining this small building with a steeple and 50 people coming in with hymnals and singing. But when you look at some church organizations right now, they're like big behemoth organizations, you know, employing 4 more than 500 people, sitting on 200 acres of land. The idea that there could be something happening from a quote unquote funding of the institution standpoint and putting a bank in a position where they don't even get to ask the questions, is that unreasonable at this point based on what church is in this day and age?
Yeah, so as denominational employees, we understand that churches are businesses, and as an unrepentant free market capitalist, I'll say this: businesses have the prerogative to set the rules for doing business with them. Their sandbox, their rules. So, but these rules need to be applied fairly and equally. And so that I think the question that we need to look at here is this a form of corporate cancel culture that's happening now? It's nothing new. Advocates and advocacy groups have used environmental and social mandates to influence businesses to cut ties with businesses like oil companies and firearms manufacturers. But now, is this cancel culture spreading to viewpoint discrimination on political and religious views? And so, as a free market person, the ironic unintended consequence in this free market exercise is inevitably going to be, wait for it, government regulation. These ideological litmus tests, if this may be the case, is not only bad optics, but it's bad business. And if it continues, it's inevitably going to lead to government intervention.
We know, ironically, Rashawn, Sam Brownback is the type of individual who has the power to end up writing an op-ed piece that gets published in a major newspaper talking about this issue. They even talk about him reaching out directly to Jamie Dimon. Like, your average American has the ability to pick up the phone and reach out to Jamie Dimon, but, the CEO of Chase. But I have to ask the question, did they more back down because it was Sam Brownback, or did they really back down because they believed in the principle? And that's the question I've got to ask myself.
No, and it's the question they actually have to ask themselves, because it's one thing to back down because of the principle. It's another if you're backing down because this individual, Brownback, has access to individuals that the normal institution or normal faith institution won't have. I think it's all a balancing act. If you think about it, the same issue on 60 Minutes some weeks back with the Mormon Church and their finances was brought up. So I think it's looking at what we're doing so that the government and regulation doesn't prohibit these faith institutions from doing their job. And in this case, it looked like, because, Brownback knew somebody, he was able to get a resolution that might be beneficial to everybody, but he was able to get it quicker. And I think that's what we have to pay attention to.
Neil, when I look at the argument of a bank from a regulatory standpoint, having the responsibility to know your customer and know where funds are coming from, I'm not sure how else you can properly do your work from a business perspective without kind of getting in the weeds of an organization, regardless of whether they're religious or not. Am I missing something here, or is there a safer path in here?
Well, I do think part of what we're seeing here is that there's a bit of frustration with government and a bit of frustration from the people and feeling like their governments are not actually impartial. I mean, to go back to Mr. Wang's point, I think it's really important that we remember if we're going to talk about corporate cancel culture, we need to also remember that cancel culture was a result of individuals feeling like legal wrongs against them and some ethical wrongs against them were not being adequately addressed. And so what happens when the people feel like they are not heard, the people do start to move. And so we are seeing pressure on organizations to demonstrate their ethics differently. And I think we've talked about this on this program before. In the midst of these type of situations, we have to be mindful that Christians do have a bit of a reputation and have used their platform and their masses to, shame and hurt a lot of people and, to encourage some violations of human rights, depending on where you align. And so we may be seeing a bit of a backlash that does not feel good to us right? Like these are not things that we want to say could be a consequence, but they may actually be a consequence. And so you take that and put that hand in hand with individuals feeling like, from a public opinion standpoint, that the legislature is ineffectual, that the Supreme Court is not impartial, which is something that many of us have relied on, I think, for most of our lives. You're going to see a bit more virtue signaling and some friction there. And so I'm not necessarily sure if I should say that the virtue signaling is bad or good, especially given that he was able to make a phone call and ultimately regain access back to his accounts. But I do think it's important for us to kind of tap into why this is happening, right? Like, we aren't just bullying Christians here. And in fact, in many cases, Christians have been the bully. And so if we see these issues start to pop up, we may need to do a bit of rebranding and a little bit of consideration as to how we engage with other people.
Well, Bettina, how do you end up finding the right role here? Because on one hand, the concept of a church being a business, and on the other hand, a bank being a regulator of businesses from a financial perspective, it seems as though there may have to be some type of happy medium. When you got churches now that have millions and millions of dollars in bank accounts coming from all over the world from sources unbeknownst. Do we now have to give maybe the banking industry a pass as it relates to certain entities and just simply say you're not allowed to really touch it, so therefore that's just where it ends? Is that transparency possible under these circumstances?
Orlin, clearly it's a difficult situation, but the reality is that in this particular scenario, there was an allegation that the rules were being applied as, or the process was being applied as a proxy for something else entirely, which was a position that the corporation was taken on a social issue to express their disagreement with Sam Brownback's political and religious views. And that there is where the nub of the problem is. Now, Nia has raised a brilliant point, which is the very sad state of the reputation of religious freedom in this country today. And yes, there's a lot of factors that have been playing into that. So many people now see religious freedom being invoked as merely a cover for bigotry. But I would argue that it is extreme voices that are defining this in such a black and white way, and that we need to start trying to moderate the conversation around religious freedom to not see it as sort of in a knee-jerk way as something negative, but something that we are all beneficiaries of in society, and to try to reclaim that in a more positive light. So, Orlin, this whole conversation, I think, needs to be placed against that backdrop. And we need to find ways for all Americans to be accommodated in our financial sector, regardless of their political or their religious beliefs.
It sounds like that question of transparency and that question of making sure that you're living your life in a way that your reputation doesn't end up harming you when it's all said and done. But the balance has to be that we still have to keep an eye on all of our regulatory organizations so that it's not the personal beliefs or anything else that may be going on that causes them to make decisions based on religion, based on your politics, and not having anything to do with the regulation in general that they've been charged to be responsible for. Following on the conversation of what we see with church organizations that sometimes are so big that it's unclear whether they still should be connected from a church or religious standpoint, there's a case that was called Catholic Charities Bureau versus the Wisconsin Labor and Industry Review Commission. This was a case where you see the Catholic dioceses across the country that were organizing their effort to meet the needs of disadvantaged individuals in a local community. And through this particular entity and other similar entities, they were trying to fulfill this mission. This is not a new role for the Catholic Church. This is something they've been engaged in for quite some time. They've engaged in a wide range of services, helping the disabled, the elderly, and the poor throughout particular areas. But this particular bureau's mission was consistent with Catholic faith. However, the courts ended up getting involved with this, taking a look to ask themselves the question, just because you're engaging in something that's for the betterment of the community, should you be protected like any other organization, quote unquote, that is a religious organization? Because for lack of a better term, religious organizations are sometimes given the power to discriminate to some degree. And if someone believes that you're not, quote unquote, this religious mission, and they come to you and say that you're not going to be allowed to be in that position, then some of the things you may want to do, you will not get a chance to do. When you take a look at this case and the court coming back and basically looking at the Catholic Charities Bureau and saying you don't deserve the exemption as being, quote unquote, a religious organization, and so other questions regarding unemployment and other laws that apply to other organizations must come into play, how do we try to find out the right connective point here? You know, Nia, when you take a look at this case, in particular when you start looking at, you know, all of the activities of it, the holding, the analysis they went through, you know, just because they had Catholic in the name apparently wasn't enough. They looked more apparently at the issues and the statements and the programs you engage in and drew their own conclusions. How should an organization that wants to be, quote unquote, religious and engage in what they would deem to be religious activities or continuations of what they do from a church perspective find themselves to be protected in some way by the law?
Yeah, I think this is extremely tricky. And mind you, I should say, I'm not a constitutional law scholar. But what I will say, you know, I think some of the questions that were brought up in the opinion, you know, this issue of statutory interpretation are quite valid. You know, like when you're within a religious group and you believe that you are looking at things through the lens of your religion, it can be very easy to perceive, you know, your organization as engaging in religious work. You know, the Catholic Church says that part of their tenets are to go into the community and actually provide aid to individuals. And so through their lens, they are engaging in, you know, charitable action. On the other hand, you know, there is something to be said about the fact that there are many other organizations that do engage in charitable works nowadays, right? It's not something that's just exclusively belonging to religious organizations. And we see some parallels of these types of issues when we look at you know, religious healthcare organizations, right? You may be aligned with a particular church, but there still may be services that you need to provide at your healthcare facility because you did opt into the market. I think another important point that should be brought up here is that, you know, we are talking about unemployment insurance, and, you know, the church doesn't get to be, and not like a specific church, but just like a religious organization does not get to be the policy lab of the state, right? Like that's not their job. The state, you know, or rather of the nation, the state in many ways gets to be the policy lab of the nation. And so, you know, this argument that, well, it's obviously more efficient, you know, I think there is something to be said about whether we should allow for churches and religious organizations or even organizations that are affiliated with religion to be able to make that final call for other individuals. So I think there's a number of different issues at play here.
But, you know, Audrey, when you take a look at this and you start looking at the concept of unemployment compensation and things of that nature, you know, one of the issues that sometimes the church has had when you're given the power to discriminate is you haven't always handled it in an even-handed way. And sometimes some regulators will start looking at the religious organizations with a side eye, wondering, are you trying to get out of something or are you really trying to help something? I mean, have you seen that, or am I missing something here? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when you look at the Wisconsin statute, the unemployment compensation statute, as well as the state constitution and the U.S. Constitution, for that matter, all require that the courts look to the undisputed religious purpose of an organization, and in this case, the Catholic diocese, in determining whether the Catholic Charities Bureau qualified for a religious exemption. And the problem with the Wisconsin Court of Appeals decision is that it separated the organization and its religious purpose, and basically ignored the Catholic Church's governance authority on how to structure their own religious ministry. And so by doing so, the court inadvertently, or maybe perhaps intentionally, applied this ridiculous "how religious are you" standard to the Catholic Charities Bureau and their subsidiary ministries. In essence, entangling the courts to assess religious questions, which violates the separation of church and state. So by saying that the Catholic Charities Bureau's activities are not religious because they don't proselytize, the court, in essence, penalized other faiths that make caring for those in need, assisting the poor, regardless of their religious background, a religious obligation.
No, but Tina, it looks like you've got an issue with this, the whole idea of who gets to determine who's religious enough. I mean, it sounds like that gets a little bit tricky here, especially when you have potentially non-religious people who may be making that decision.
I mean, Andre made a series of excellent points, and these are the constitutional issues that are at the heart of the case that the court actually ran roughshod over. I mean, as Andre pointed out, I mean, there is a massive irony at the heart of this case, a catch-22, because as the Catholic charity was doing its work, it was deliberately being non-proselytizing. It was not discriminating on the basis of religion. It was complying with all those obligations that a charity must abide by in providing its services to the community. But because they were doing that, it allowed the court to say that what they were doing was non-religious. I mean, so they're caught if they do it, they're caught if they don't do it. I mean, there, and another thing that Andre pointed out was that, by forcing Wisconsin officials, whether at the executive branch or in courts, to start delving into the inside workings of a church entity, it is an unconstitutional entanglement. And, they are deliberately trying to decide whether activities are inherently or primarily religious.
Right.
That's unconstitutional entanglement. And so, the whole route that the court took in coming to its conclusion didn't engage with these core constitutional issues. And I think, I hope that this decision will be reviewed.
Rashawn, you're somebody who's had to take a look at issues regarding public policy and how you try to figure out how to, quote unquote, make the right decisions, regardless of maybe sometimes what the bigger law may say. And in this instance here, it seems like this is not just a question about unemployment compensation. This is more a question of, how does an organization make itself available for somebody to tell them that this is not part of your quote unquote religious activities just because you're not going out and proselytizing in some way. Do you see what the issue is here? And what are your thoughts as it relates to how an organization can even move forward under these circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, the problem arises even more so now than it probably has done since the turn of the century. And that is you find more and more nonprofits and more faith organizations that are standing in the gap of what government used to do. We saw a shift from government doing a lot of things in the late 1970s, 1980s to more and more having the private sector or the nonprofit and the faith community. As that has now come about, you now find the government saying, well, we need to make sure that they're following all of our rules and regulations in order to receive or do these things. And then you get in this case, you get the government stepping into something I'm sure it does not want to step in. I wouldn't want to do it as a legislator and certainly wouldn't want to do it as an executive. And that is determining, how faithful is the tenets of the faith organization. I think the problem becomes when, you look at over-regulations and solving a problem that isn't a problem. Mm. And that is somebody decided that we needed to make sure that these organizations were paying their fair share if they were not acting in a religious way, that they were not skirting the current laws. And I think in this case, they overstepped their bounds.
Nia, when you look at this, though, I got to ask the question, when you ask the question of efficiency, which seems to be part of the language that came up here, it was more about whether or not they're going to have to be moved into an inefficient operation or efficient operation. And, are you comfortable with the idea of courts even being involved in a sincerity test or determination of what makes one religious and not religious? I mean, how do you see it from your perspective?
Well, again, as I said, I want to make sure that I'm deferring to the constitutional law folks on the show because they are the ones who spend the most time in these spaces. But I do think, this idea of churches standing in the gap is an idea that's not new. I mean, even when we look at the history of Black American churches, this is primarily what they did when the government was determined to be unjust. They literally filled in the gaps. And so I do think that this is something that will come up time and time again as we look at inefficiencies in the world and folks want to, step in. But I do think that there's something very specific when we're talking about an unemployment benefit, which is something that is afforded to everyone. And even though, like, there are a number of questions regarding, like, how do we want the Supreme Court making determinations about what is religious and what is not religious and who is religious and who is not, there also is a nuance of, what topic we're actually talking about. Unemployment insurance is something that is available to everyone. And we don't typically delegate to private organizations unless they're brought in, let's say, in a consulting capacity to decide what is efficient and what is not efficient, right? Especially when you have state programs. The idea is that the appropriate forum to address these issues are potentially in the legislature, right? If you feel like, the way that unemployment is structured is inefficient, then you go through those appropriate channels. Even if a church believes that they're doing something efficient, it may be a little inappropriate for them to step in their ways. And I think that's when you started seeing a bit of crossfiring happening here.
So, Andre, if I've got to make you counsel for the Catholic Charities Bureau at the next level, what's your strongest argument that you make in order to allow them to move forward with this?
Well, they say the more things change, the more things stay the same. And you would think that a question like this would be well settled laws as it applies to the religious liberty clauses and statutes. And so, breaking news: the good point on this is that on April 18th, just a few weeks ago, the Wisconsin Supreme Court agreed to review the lower court's decisions.
So it looks like the court is finally going to come in, try to get a little bit more involved. But as many of us know, just because it ends up at the next level doesn't mean you'll end up with the right solution. And we've seen many times, sometimes you go to the next level and the decision there is even more confusing. So I think the way we keep looking at these cases, we have to remember that if churches aren't doing the right thing, sometimes they can complicate their lives in ways in the future that was totally unintended. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So even though we're not talking about healthcare in the same way that we were talking about it maybe 5 to 10 years ago when we're thinking about Medicaid expansion, I'm happy to report that there are still states that are expanding Medicaid, which means that insurance coverage is increasing for many different communities, including marginalized communities and non-marginalized communities. Even in states that have been traditionally red or purple, like North Carolina, have been taking those steps. So that's something you may not know.
Wow. Rashawn, tell me something I don't know.
Throughout Nia's young life, Prince George's County was the wealthiest African-American community in the nation and probably the world. And that is no longer the case. It is now Charles County in Maryland.
Wow. New information. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Jamie Dimon, the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan Chase, met his wife, Judy, when they were both students at Harvard. On their first date, she had to pay for the date because Mr. Dimon had no money.
Thanks a lot. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, we've been talking about religious charities standing in the gap. Did you know that a third of all charitable giving in the US goes to faith-based charities, and 40% of the largest 50 charities in the US are also faith-based? Pull out faith-based charity and the whole sector collapses.
Wow. Well, thanks so much for that information. Hey, listen, it was great talking with you guys and appreciate all that you have presented for us today. Thanks again for being with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.